kind of a zero, more of a zero-based budgeting approach to thinking about reform.
In the spirit of this conference, we are going to just take a 5-minute break so that we make another seamless transition to governance and inclusion, which session will be chaired by Dr. Samuel Paul. And our principal speaker is Dr. Anuradha Joshi from IDS Sussex. And we shall make that session as engaging as all our other sessions. So you can take a 5-minute break and come back. Thank you.
Okay. May I request the participants to please reassemble in the conference hall? May I request the participants to please reassemble in the conference hall for the next session? Thank you. Book launch at Vigyan Bhavan. Please reach the venue by 6:15, though the program starts at 6:30, because there are a lot of entry requirements. And please get your invite, the card, and the parking sticker that was sent with it or afterwards. And there are 2 gates to Vigyan Bhavan, and one is a VIP gate and the other is a non-VIP gate. I think you will see boards with the name of the event at the gates, so it will be easy to identify which gate you have to
I think most of us are East Gate.
East Gate is the main entry gate for today. And when you go inside Vigyan Bhavan, there are these markers. We have got the posters for the event, which will lead you to the hall number 4. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Inclusion and governance. Almost like the residuals of the discussion of the preceding sessions, they have been referred to as issues. But I would maintain that these 2 themes could be discussed quite apart from the urban context with which we are concerned here. Many of you are urban experts, planners, administrators. And when Ishar invited me to write a chapter, it didn't occur to me that I had to tailor it to the urban context, and I didn't do it. Because many of the issues we are talking about in this part, at least my paper, could apply to governance in general. It certainly would apply even more to the problem of inclusion. The need to bring in the entire population, especially the more vulnerable, within the net of your urban design, planning, and implementation. There are 3 chapters, and I see that authors of the second chapter is here. I don't see Deepak Parikh, so I assume Anuradha may comment on it, but we may not have a discussion on that particular paper. And I'm glad we have Anuradha with us, who herself has an urban planning background but has been more into development and inclusion issues in recent years. I invite Anuradha to speak to us first, and then we'll have Bimal and Mr. Pathak, both of you, to comment on their papers. Thank you. Anuradha.
Thank you very much. I must say that after Paul's very impassioned and excellent presentation, it's going to be a hard act to follow, but I'll try. And I think particularly because I think this particular topic of inclusion and urbanization is extremely important for this any further work on urbanization opportunities and challenges. I should say this book offers a welcome addition to the literature on urbanization in India. And I just want to say something about the framework that is used in the book, which is how to balance the private benefit costs with the social benefit costs of urbanization. There are obviously costs of agglomeration, but also benefits of agglomeration that accrue socially as well as privately. And the aim is, of course, to reap the productivity gains of agglomeration, as well as improve the lives of all urban dwellers. And this session will focus on the all urban dwellers. In terms of, there are two aspects to this issue of inclusion and governance, I think. One is of the capacity of urban local bodies, as has been mentioned several times in earlier sessions. And the second is of democratic representation. Who gets to have a voice in how the city is designed, grows, and is serviced, financed as well, taking from the previous session. There are three parts of the three chapters in the book that cover these issues of governance and social inclusion. The first one is on Demand for Good Governance by Professor Paul Samuel. And then it underscores the important role that citizens play in acting as a watchdog on what government does and demanding better services and demanding accountability. And the next two focus on slightly different aspects of housing, one on slum redevelopment and affordable housing, and the other one on financing affordable housing. What I'll do briefly is to outline some of the strengths of these chapters and what they point out, and then go on to say some of the things that we could be looking at in a future urban research agenda, given the experience on these issues in other countries. But before I do that, I want to explore a little bit what we mean by inclusion. And I want to make it clear that for me, inclusion means both the outcomes, which is generally thought of as inclusion, outcomes of processes of urbanization, do the benefits accrue to all members of society. But I think it also means the processes of how these outcomes are coming to be. So do people have actually a voice in how decisions get made? And I should also say that inclusion refers to usually as consumers of services. So we talk about the urban poor accessing water, etc. But I think we should also think about inclusion of producers of services. So those low-income providers, for example, of services in low-income settlements, which we don't tend to necessarily include when we think about inclusion. Okay. The three chapters, I think, treat these different sides of this inclusion-exclusion debate. On the one hand, like I said, the first one talks about the processes through which people excluded from enjoying basic urban services can demand inclusion and accountability. And the latter two focus on urban policies and state structures that can actively work to exclude certain populations and groups from affordable housing in particular. And like I said before, they raise two issues. One is that of technical capacities of urban local governments and that are required to make these processes and outcomes inclusive, and also of democratic representation. And I'm going to focus a little bit more on the democratic representation and politics side of things, because I think that hasn't got enough attention in the discussion so far, although different people have raised it at different times as being important. So quickly to say what these chapters are about. The chapter by Patel and Pathak focuses on integrating redevelopment of slums and is an important contribution to the debate. It uses examples from Mumbai and Ahmedabad to show the limitations of an approach to affordable housing that's focused on subsidizing housing developer incentives, inclusionary zoning, and also transfer of development rights. Those sorts of approaches, I think they've pointed out quite nicely, have some limits. The solution, they argue, lies in a dual strategy. On the one hand, to increase the supply of formal housing that's affordable by processes such as lowering standards, etc. On the one hand, so that you lower the cost of legal homes that can be accessed by all groups. And then on the other hand, to do something such as in situ upgrading, providing tenure improvement, the old sites and services schemes, etc., that increase the supply of affordable housing at the lowest end of the market. These are all promising solutions. The Parekh paper, since the author is not here, I think I'll say a little bit about as well. It focuses on affordable housing in terms of financing, and addresses the lack of appropriated sources of housing finance, for example, mortgages, etc. The chapter also takes like a slightly international view, drawing in experiences from other countries, including Brazil's program of giving grants for down payments, Turkey's housing authorities providing affordable long-term loans and loan guarantees, etc. The chapter argues forcefully for the inclusion of the private sector in the provision of affordable housing for the poor. And there's a set of reforms that the author proposes, including regulation of land markets, land policy reforms, real estate investment trusts, micro-mortgages, that sounded interesting, among several others. This isn't the area of my own expertise, and I think it's more in Paul's terrain, so I won't comment too much on the sort of financing of affordable housing, although I think it's a really important issue. From an inclusion perspective, access to affordable and adequate housing, some would argue, is the key pathway to inclusion in the city. And that's why these two chapters on housing are important in a section on inclusion in urban areas. Because housing goes beyond its function as a shelter. It's a right, a commodity. It can be used as collateral for gaining loans. It confers legal status. There's a whole range of things that housing does that's beyond just its use as a shelter. And that's why, it's critical that migrants, the poor, all sections of society have some access or a right to housing, in a sense. On the other hand, lack of affordable housing has a large number of public bads happening at the same time. It leads to a lack of access to environmental services, sanitation, water, hygiene, etc., poor access to healthcare and education and economic opportunities, and these can have negative impacts on the larger city as a whole, particularly in the health field, I think. We know that, for example, in a study of health effects on children on the replacement of dirt floors with cement floors in houses in Mexico, it found that there was a huge reduction in parasitic infections and communicable diseases. We know that the lack of housing stability, for one, leads to deterioration in school outcomes, for example, test scores in education. Overcrowding results in exposure to infectious diseases such as tuberculosis and meningitis, etc. We know all these things. There are really bad things that come with having forced people into poor, inadequate quality of housing. And by inadequate, we mean not just sort of the physical structure, but also legal security of tenure, availability of services, affordability, habitability, accessibility, location, and cultural adequacy. This definition comes from the UN Habitat definition of adequate housing. So basically then, housing is not just an end itself, it's also a means to achieving other ends. And we need to pay more attention to two issues that are only lightly discussed in these chapters, and one issue in particular that's discussed in another chapter, but I think is critical, especially in terms of affordability of housing for the most vulnerable groups. The first question is of rental housing. While there's some mention in the chapters, this is a really neglected subject, and I think attention to this, and particularly in the Indian context, is quite required. Given that housing has been viewed as a safe investment for a long time, people do invest in buying housing, those who have housing stock, rather, as an investment. But this is not released for renting purposes for a long host of reasons, some of which were mentioned in the morning session.